In December of 1917, the largest man-made explosion before the atomic bomb would devastate the Canadian harbor city of Halifax, killing over 2,000 people. But despite its size and deadly impact, almost no one talks about it today. So what caused this disaster and why has it been forgotten? It was the kind of frigid winter morning that made you want to stay inside by the fire. And for most of the people living in Halifax, Canada in 1917, that's exactly what they did. They were enjoying a quiet day at home, unaware that by the end of the day their entire world would be shattered. On December 6, 1917, the captain of the French ship L'Iroquois was preparing to leave port. He had a full cargo hold of dangerous goods, including 3,500 tons of picric acid, which is an explosive chemical compound. He was taking this shipment from France to New York City, where it would be used to manufacture more explosives for World War I. The war had been raging in Europe for 3 years already, and America had finally decided to join the Allied forces, so these explosives were needed more than ever. But back in Halifax, the captain was having trouble getting his ship out of the harbor. His first mate would later recall that the wind was so strong that day that the ship almost lost control and hit the bottom of the harbor. It was definitely not the ideal condition for an already dangerous voyage. Picric acid was extremely volatile and sensitive to temperature changes. Experts believe that the cold weather may have caused the chemical to expand and put extra pressure on the ship's hull. As the Iroquois tried to navigate the rough waters, the ship began to crack. The captain immediately realized he was in trouble, but there wasn't anything he could do except try to get the ship to shore. At this point, he knew that if the vessel sank or the cargo spilled into the water, the entire harbor could explode. Meanwhile, on the dock, people began to notice the danger as well. A nearby tugboat sounded the alarm and shouted across the icy waves to the men on the ship, "Don't move, she's going to blow up." Captain Rocher, who was standing on the dock with several other crew members, saw a plume of smoke coming from the hold of the ship. He turned to run, but it was too late. At precisely 9:04 a.m., the French ship exploded, leaving nothing but a giant crater behind. People in the harbor felt the air in their lungs literally explode in their chests. Captain Rocher, who was just feet away from the ship when it blew up, would later tell reporters that he had been thrown through the air like a rag doll. Luckily, the captain had survived, but he was the exception. Within the blink of an eye, the entire city of Halifax had been leveled. Buildings had been reduced to matchstick, and thousands of people had been killed. The explosion at Halifax Harbor was actually the largest man-made explosion prior to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. During World War II, it was 4 times more powerful than the space shuttle Challenger explosion and 10 times larger than the terrorist attack in Oklahoma City. In total, 2,000 people lost their lives in the blast, while another 9,000 were injured. Most of the victims were civilians who had absolutely nothing to do with the war. Many of them were women and children. The force of the explosion was so great that it could be heard 250 kilometers away in the province of New Brunswick. It even created a tsunami in the harbor that capsized ships that had been destroyed by the blast wave. For miles around the harbor, the water receded, revealing a muddy seabed. Then the water rushed back in, destroying everything in its path. Debris from the explosion rained down over an area of 8 square kilometers, spreading destruction as far as Richmond and Dartmouth on the other side of the harbor. Miraculously, the neighboring towns had been mostly spared, but the damage within the city was catastrophic. Homes had been obliterated, factories and warehouses lay in ruins, streets had been ripped apart. In some places, every single building had been destroyed. Rescue workers began combing through the rubble, searching for survivors, but they soon realized that there weren't many left. This disaster was simply too big. Whole families had been wiped out. Some of the victims had been burned beyond recognition, others had simply vanished. The explosion had happened so quickly that many people hadn't even had time to scream. Dr. Archibald McCurdy, who headed the medical services at Halifax City Hospital, later recalled the grim scene. "When I got there, all the doctors and nurses were just standing around in their hospital gowns, not knowing what to do. There were no patients in the wards. They were all out on the streets. Couldn't go out then because there was danger of further explosions. We got word to come at 8 o'clock in the morning. I got there about 9:30. All I can remember is a complete and utter havoc of humanity, indescribable. By the afternoon, hospitals across the city had filled with victims. Many of them had terrible burns covering their bodies. Their clothes had been blown off in the blast, and their skin had been seared by the intense heat. Others had head injuries and broken bones. Sadly, there weren't enough doctors and nurses to help everyone. Many victims had to wait for hours in unbearable pain. But it wasn't just their bodies that had been damaged. The explosion had also taken something away from them that would never be recovered. The blast had blown away their minds. Hundreds of people suffered from amnesia after the explosion, not remembering anything about themselves or their loved ones. Others had become mute, unable to speak a single word. In the days following the disaster, the city of Halifax was in complete chaos. People wandered around in a daze, not knowing what had happened. Many of them were still covered in the debris of the disaster. In the midst of all this horror, there was one bright spot: dogs. Somehow the dogs seemed to be okay, suffering only slight injuries, if any. They licked their wounds, barked frantically, and searched for their owners among the ruins. One man later told reporters that he had been separated from his wife in the blast, but they were reunited thanks to their dog, who had stayed by their side and refused to leave. As the sun began to set each night, people huddled together for warmth and comfort, sharing whatever food they had. Luckily, the disaster had occurred in the middle of winter, so most people had supplies stored in their homes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them alive. Within days, however, those supplies began to dwindle, and something even worse began to appear in the streets: dead bodies. Thousands of people had died in the explosion, and unfortunately, not enough resources were available to bury them all properly. Soon, entire hills of corpses could be seen rising above the city. The stench was so bad that people had to cover their noses with rags. Halifax was in desperate need of help, and help would eventually arrive in the form of the American Army. Just 2 weeks earlier, the United States had declared war on Germany. President Woodrow Wilson was eager to show the world that America was a force to be reckoned with. Sending troops to help the Canadians would be a great way to demonstrate that power. But not everyone was happy about this. Many people in Halifax believed that the Americans were only interested in taking advantage of their disaster, that they had ulterior motives for sending aid. These suspicions were only fueled by the fact that American troops began arriving in trucks emblazoned with the words, "Take it easy, Canada, we're coming." Despite these tensions, the Americans did help to restore order to the city. They set up relief camps for the homeless and began burying the dead. Unfortunately, they didn't have enough body bags, so they simply piled the corpses into mass graves. In the end, 2,000 people died at Halifax Harbor. But many experts believe that number could have been much higher had the disaster occurred just a few hours earlier. If the cargo ship had blown up when the workers were on their way to the harbor, say to pick up the cargo, thousands more people could have died. After the disaster, the French government offered to pay for the damages, but this offer was declined. The Canadians felt that accepting the money would be a humiliating admission that they couldn't handle the situation themselves. But although the French didn't financially support the rebuilding effort, they did send a replacement ship, the Iphigenie. This vessel arrived in Halifax on January 2, 1918, carrying more explosives to replace the cargo that had been lost in the blast. The irony was not lost on the Canadians, who were still recovering from the previous explosion. But they accepted the delivery anyway, since the war effort was more important than their own safety. In the aftermath of the disaster, many questions were raised as to how such a catastrophe could have been prevented. Some people blamed the captain of the Iroquois for trying to sail in such bad weather. Others blamed the crew for loading the ship improperly. Still others blamed the French government for sending such a dangerous shipment in the first place. In reality, the disaster was the result of a perfect storm of unfortunate events. There was no one person to blame. But one thing was clear: such a disaster could never happen again. Today, a memorial stands in Halifax Harbor to commemorate the lives that were lost. Every year on December 6th, people gather at the waterfront to remember the victims and to honor the survivors. Do you know about this disaster before today? Let me know in the comments and check out these videos.